Reflections on Gandhi by George Orwell. Saints should always be judged guilty until they are proved innocent, but the tests that have to be applied to them are not, of course, the same in all cases. In Gandhi's case, the questions one feels inclined to ask are, to what extent was Gandhi moved by vanity, by the consciousness of himself as a humble, naked old man, sitting on a praying mat and shaking empires by sheer spiritual power, and to what extent did he compromise his own principles by entering politics, which of their nature are inseparable from coercion and fraud? To give a definite answer, one would have to study Gandhi's acts and writings in immense detail, for his whole life was a sort of pilgrimage, in which every act was significant. But this partial autobiography, which ends in the 1920s, is strong evidence in his favor. All the more because it covers what he would have called the unregenerate part of his life, and reminds one that inside the saint, or near saint, there was a very shrewd, able person who could, if he had chosen, have been a brilliant success as a lawyer, an administrator, or perhaps even a businessman. At about the time when the autobiography first appeared, I remember reading its opening chapters in the ill-printed pages of some Indian newspaper. They made a good impression on me, which Gandhi himself at that time did not. The things that one associated with him, homespun cloth, quote-unquote soul forces, and vegetarianism, were unappealing, and his medievalist program was obviously not viable in a backward, starving, overpopulated country. It was also apparent that the British were making use of him, or thought they were making use of him. Strictly speaking, as a nationalist, he was an enemy. But since in every crisis he would exert himself to prevent violence, which from the British point of view meant preventing any effective action whatever, he could be regarded as quote-unquote our man. In private, this was sometimes cynically admitted. The attitude of the Indian millionaires was similar. Gandhi called upon them to repent, and naturally they preferred him to the socialists and communists who, given the chance, would actually have taken their money away. How reliable such calculations are in the long run is doubtful. As Gandhi himself says, quote, "In the end deceivers deceive only themselves," unquote. But at any rate, the gentleness with which he was nearly always handled was due partly to the feeling that he was useful. The British conservatives only became really angry with him when, as in 1942, he was in effect turning his nonviolence against a different conqueror. But I could see even then that the British officials who spoke of him with a mixture of amusement and disapproval also genuinely liked and admired him after a fashion. Nobody ever suggested that he was corrupt or ambitious in any vulgar way, or that anything he did was actuated by fear or malice. In judging a man like Gandhi, one seems instinctively to apply high standards, so that some of his virtues have passed almost unnoticed. For instance, it is clear even from the autobiography that his natural physical courage was quite astounding. The manner of his death was a later illustration of this, for a public man who has attached any value to his own skin would have been more adequately guarded. Again, he seems to have been quite free from that maniacal suspiciousness which, as E. M. Forster rightly says in his book A Passage to India, is the besetting Indian vice, just as hypocrisy is the British vice. Although no doubt he was shrewd enough in detecting dishonesty, he seems wherever possible to have believed that other people were acting in good faith, and had a better nature through which they could be approached. And though he came of a poor middle-class family, started life rather unfavorably, and was probably of unimpressive physical appearance, he was not afflicted by envy or by the feeling of inferiority. Color feeling, when he first met it in its worst form in South Africa, seems rather to have astonished him. Even when he was fighting what was in effect a color war, he did not think of people in terms of race or status. The governor of a province, a cotton millionaire, a half-starved Dravidian coolie, a British private soldier, were all equally human beings, to be approached in much the same way. It is noticeable that even in the worst possible circumstances, as in South Africa when he was making himself unpopular as the champion of the Indian community, he did not lack European friends. Written in short lengths for newspaper serialization, the autobiography is not a literary masterpiece, but it is the more impressive because of the commonplaceness of much of its material. It is well to be reminded that Gandhi started out with the normal ambitions of a young Indian student and only adopted his extremist opinions by degrees, and, in some cases, rather unwillingly. There was a time, it is interesting to learn, when he wore a top hat, took dancing lessons, studied French and Latin, went up the Eiffel Tower, and even tried to learn the violin. All this was the idea of assimilating European civilization as thoroughly as possible. He was not one of those saints who are marked out by their phenomenal piety from childhood onwards, nor one of the other kind who forsake the world after sensational debaucheries. He makes full confession of the misdeeds of his youth, but in fact there is not much to confess. As a frontispiece to the book, there is a photograph of Gandhi's possessions at the time of his death. The whole outfit could be purchased for about €5, and Gandhi's sins, at least his fleshly sins, would make the same sort of appearance if placed all in one heap. A few cigarettes, a few mouthfuls of meat, a few annas pilfered in childhood from the maidservant, 2 visits to a brothel. On each occasion he got away without quote-unquote doing anything. 1 narrowly escaped lapse with his landlady in Plymouth. 1 outburst of temper. That is, about the whole collection. Almost from childhood onwards he had a deep earnestness, an attitude ethical rather than religious, but, until he was about 30, no very definite sense of direction. His first entry into anything describable as public life was made by way of vegetarianism. Underneath his less ordinary qualities, one feels all the time the solid middle-class businessmen who were his ancestors. One feels that even after he had abandoned personal ambition, he must have been a resourceful, energetic lawyer and a hard-headed political organizer, careful in keeping down expenses, an adroit handler of committees, and an indefatigable chaser of subscriptions. His character was an extraordinarily mixed one, but there was almost nothing in it that you can put your finger on and call bad. And I believe that even Gandhi's worst enemies would admit that he was an interesting and unusual man who enriched the world simply by being alive. Whether he was also a lovable man, and whether his teachings can have much value for those who do not accept the religious beliefs on which they are founded, I have never felt fully certain. Of late years, it has been the fashion to talk about Gandhi as though he were not only sympathetic to the Western left-wing movement, but were integrally part of it. Anarchists and pacifists, in particular, have claimed him for their own, noticing only that he was opposed to centralism and state violence, and ignoring the otherworldly, anti-humanist tendency of his doctrines. But one should, I think, realize that Gandhi's teachings cannot be squared with the belief that man is the measure of all things, and that our job is to make life worth living on this earth, which is the only earth we have. They make sense only on the assumption that God exists, and that the world of solid objects is an illusion to be escaped from. It is worth considering the disciplines which Gandhi imposed on himself, and which, though he might not insist on every one of his followers observing every detail, he considered indispensable if one wanted to serve either God or humanity. First of all, no meat eating, and if possible, no animal food in any form. Gandhi himself, for the sake of his health, had to compromise on milk, but seems to have felt even this to be a backsliding. No alcohol or tobacco, and no spices or condiments even of a vegetable kind, since food should be taken not for its own sake, but solely in order to preserve one's strength. Secondly, if possible, no sexual intercourse. If sexual intercourse must happen, then it should be for the sole purpose of begetting children, and presumably at long intervals. Gandhi himself, in his middle 30s, took the vow of brahmacharya, which means not only complete chastity, but the elimination of sexual desire. This condition, it seems, is difficult to attain without a special diet and frequent fasting. One of the dangers of milk drinking is that it is apt to arouse sexual desire. And finally, this is the cardinal point, for the seeker after goodness, there must be no close friendships and no exclusive loves whatsoever. Close friendships, Gandhi says, are dangerous because, quote, friends react on one another, unquote, and through loyalty to a friend, one can be led into wrongdoing. This is unquestionably true. Moreover, if one is to love God, or to love humanity as a whole, one cannot give one's preference to any individual person. This again is true, and it marks the point at which the humanistic and the religious attitude cease to be reconcilable. To an ordinary human being, love means nothing if it does not mean loving some people more than others. The autobiography leaves it uncertain whether Gandhi behaved in an inconsiderate way to his wife and children, but at any rate it makes clear that on 3 occasions he was willing to let his wife or a child die rather than administer the animal food prescribed by a doctor. It is true that the threatened death never actually occurred, and also true that Gandhi, with, one gathers, a good deal of moral pressure in the opposite direction, always gave the patient the choice of staying alive at the price of committing a sin. Still, if the decision had been solely his own, he would have forbidden the animal food, whatever the risks might be. There must, he says, be some limit